On August 2013, a 43-year-old French woman landed at Tehran's Imam Khomeini International Airport. Identified only as Catherine, she'd been in Iran before. Catherine was a charismatic French convert to Islam who had fallen in love with the culture and language of the Middle East. She spoke fluent Arabic and Farsi and could hold her own in any theological debate. While the details of her arrest are unclear, what followed was almost certainly a show trial. Was she a Mossad agent who got into deep, or an Iranian who spied on her own country for the West, or simply a brilliant sociopath who chose to betray the regime that gave her so much? Today, Iranian media still calls her a spy, and her name is now blacklisted across Iranian platforms. As for her former colleagues at Shahid Beheshti University, they remember her as a brilliant teacher who was deeply loved by her students. Suddenly, Catherine seemed to disappear from the public eye. According to some accounts, Catherine was not a foreign agent at all. The truth is we may never know. What we do know is that she lived a remarkable life. She was a linguist, a religious scholar, a spy, a terrorist. She was many things to many people. But above all, she was a master manipulator who understood the power of identity. She was an Iranian who wanted nothing more than to live in Iran. That means she didn't need to convert to Islam or criticize the regime. It's a story about how ideology can blind a government to infiltration, how identity can be used as a weapon, how one person can shake the foundation of a regime with words, not weapons. For better or for worse, Catherine remains a controversial figure, hated in Tehran, watched in Israel, and studied by journalists and intelligence analysts around the world. If you like stories like this one, you should check out my podcast where I interview top journalists and experts on national security and foreign policy. I'll see you next time. She simply needed to find a husband. If you want to live in Iran, you see, you must first get married to an Iranian citizen. But finding such a husband isn't easy, especially for a foreigner like Catherine. Not only does the potential spouse have to agree to marry a non-Muslim, but he also has to be willing to leave Iran and start a new life abroad. That is a big ask, so Catherine did something crazy. She pretended to be a Muslim convert and reached out to some of the regime's most powerful figures. They were impressed by her knowledge of Islam and invited her into their homes and their lives. Eventually, one of them agreed to marry her. But when it came time to consummate the marriage, Catherine refused. She told her husband that she wasn't really Muslim and that she never intended to convert. The husband was furious, but he had no choice but to accept the situation. After all, he had just married a French woman who didn't speak a word of Farsi. Such a marriage was doomed from the start. So the husband approached the regime and offered to cut Catherine a deal. He would divorce her if she gave him enough money to start a new life. She agreed. And suddenly Catherine found herself with a mountain of cash and a ticket out of Iran. She stopped publishing books and articles and even canceled her speaking engagements. Then, in 2013, she turned up in Tehran, ostensibly to teach at Shahid Beheshti University. But it soon became clear that her real mission was something else entirely. According to informed sources, the moment Catherine set foot in Iran, she was met by agents of the Revolutionary Guard who whisked her away to an undisclosed location. Over the next few months, they brainwashed her and forced her to spy on her former friends and colleagues at the university. Once she was ready, she returned to her old life and began working as a literature professor. It was here that she gathered intel for her Mossad handlers, who used it to blackmail high-ranking members of the Iranian regime. Catherine Perez Sheikhdom may be gone, but her story lives on. On November 2013, she was convicted of espionage and sentenced to death. No appeal was necessary. 2 weeks later, she was executed by hanging. Or was she? There are conflicting reports over whether she was actually hanged. An informed source tells me she wasn't. Instead, she recanted her conversion to Islam, proving once and for all that she never really belonged to the religion she professed to love so much. The Iranian regime released her and deported her back to France. She also just happened to have spent a year studying in Jerusalem and had converted to Islam while there. That was in 2005. And she would go on to earn a doctorate in the history of Shiite Islam from Paris. The platform has really cracked down on how many views a video gets before it's demonetized. In the early 2000s, she attracted the attention of the regime by criticizing its treatment of Baha'i, a religious minority that has been persecuted in Iran since the Islamic Revolution. But it was her book, Zionism in the Eyes of Islam, that really got under the regime's skin. Published in 2009, the book argues that modern political Zionism actually predates the Holocaust and that the idea of a Jewish state was first conceived in Europe in the late 19th century. In other words, according to Catherine, Zionism is a political movement, not a religious one. Now, that might seem like a pretty innocuous argument. But in Iran, which uses the Holocaust as propaganda against Jews, such an argument is tantamount to heresy. The book was immediately banned, and Catherine herself was placed under the watchful eye of Iran's morality police. Nonetheless, she continued to speak out against the regime. And in 2010, she was named one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies program in Jordan. So if you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me through donations. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to the show. Throughout her career, she taught at universities around France, including Sciences Po and the University of Paris. In the meantime, she developed a particular interest in Sufism, a mystical form of Islam that emphasizes poetry and music. And she became especially fascinated with the thought of the 13th century Persian poet Rumi. In fact, Catherine even helped found an institute dedicated to Rumi's work. All this is to say that when she first arrived in Iran, Catherine was well known among the educated classes. She published several books on Sufism in both French and English, and even lectured at some universities in Tehran. Among Iran's intelligentsia, she was considered an expert on Islam, so when she applied for a job teaching literature at the prestigious Shahid Beheshti University, it was almost a foregone conclusion that she would get it. She did, and that is when her real work began. In fact, she'd been there several times in the past few years. But this time was different. This time she was arrested. However, what we do know is that while in Tehran, she cultivated ties to several influential figures, including members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. These connections were made possible by her fluency in Farsi and her apparent knowledge of Islam. But they wouldn't have happened without something else, something she possessed in abundance, an almost supernatural ability to read people and play on their emotions. Those who knew her describe her as possessing an incredible personality. She had a disarming smile and a way of talking that put people at ease. And because of that, many of Iran's elite welcomed her into their homes and their lives. It was through these people that she gained access to some of the regime's most sensitive information, including details about its nuclear program. The extent of her infiltration is unknown, but it is clear that she was able to gather intelligence that Western agencies could not have gotten otherwise. And so ended the remarkable double life of Catherine Perez Sheikhdom, the alleged Israeli spy who infiltrated Iran's elite. What follows is the full story of one of the most unlikely spies of the 21st century. We begin with her cover story. Now, there is no public evidence that she worked for Mossad or any other intelligence agency. In the meantime, the Iranian media continued to denounce her as a Zionist entity. And so the legend of Catherine Perez Sheikhdom was born. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to my channel. Catherine was already a notorious figure in Iran when she arrived in Tehran. It was probably only a matter of time before the regime came down on her hard, but then something strange happened. But there's another theory, one that paints Catherine in a much different light. So who was Catherine Perez Sheikhdom? A Mossad agent, an Iranian national, or simply a clever sociopath who played the regime for all it was worth? In the end, Catherine's story is more than a spy thriller.